George Milton character. George is described as physically small with very sharp features and opposite to Lenny Small. Milton is the last name of the author of one of Steinberg's favourite books, Paradise Lost. In that epic poem, Adam and Eve fall from grace in the Garden of Eden. Because of their fall, mankind is doomed to be alone and walk the earth as a lonely being. Some critics believe George represents the doomed man who longs to return to Eden. His one character to avoid that fate is a relationship with Lenny, which makes them different from the other lonely men. But despite this companionship, at the end of the book, George is fated to be once again alone. George's personality often reflects both anger and understanding of the two men. He is the one who thinks through and considers how their goals can be reached. Once Candy makes the stake possible, George comes up with the details: where they will get the ranch, how long they must work to pay for it, and how they will have to keep a low profile in order to work for the next month. George also foresees possible complications and gives Lenny advice about what he must do in order to help their future. While George can be very rational and thoughtful, he also gets frustrated and angry with Lenny because the big man cannot control his strength or actions. George repeatedly gets angry, so much so that Lenny knows by heart what he means when George gives him hell. But George's anger quickly fades when he remembers Lenny's innocence and his inability to remember or think clearly. George, unlike other men, has a companion and a friend in Lenny. Because of this, Lenny makes George feel special. They are different from all the other guys, and George realizes only too well that they have a special bond. At the ranch, George often plays solitaire, a game of one. Without Lenny, George would be a loner. Even though George gets frustrated by Lenny's mental weakness, he also feels compassion for his friend. Lenny offers George the opportunity to lay plans, give advice, and in general, be in charge. Without Lenny, George would be just like the other hands, but with Lenny, George has a strong sense of responsibility. In the end, he even takes responsibility for Lenny's death. George also understands that Lenny does not have an adult sense of guilt and does not understand death or murder beyond it being a bad thing. George makes it possible for Lenny, sometimes, to understand at least partially consequences of his actions. Unfortunately, George does not realize how dangerous Lenny can be, and his lack of foresight adds to the downfall of their dreams. This dream also sets George apart from the others because it means he and Lenny have a future and something to anticipate. Unlike Lenny, George does not see their dream in terms of rabbits. Instead, he sees them in a practical way. Their farm will be one where they can be independent and safe, and where he will not have to worry about keeping track of Lenny's mistakes. They can be secure and in charge of their own lives. However, Lenny is the one who adds the enthusiasm because George never really believed they could swing this farm of their own. He mostly uses the story to give Lenny something to believe in for their future. Only when Candy offers the stake does George actually begin to see that this dream could come true. Realistic that he is, George tells Candy over the lifelessness body of Curly's wife, "I think I'd knowed from the very first, I think I'd knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much I got to thinking maybe we would." In the end, George Milton is man alone once again. George Milton continued. George is a protective man who has been caring for his friend Lenny for a long time. The two men are not related, but they have been friends since they were children. So as well as enjoying his company, George also feels responsible for his welfare. George often talks to Lenny about their dream. Due to Lenny's mental disability, George has to take responsibility for him and finds it stressful and frustrating at times, due to Lenny getting into trouble. This results in outbursts of anger towards Lenny at certain points in the novel, although George regrets these quickly. George recognizes that his friendship with Lenny is special because men like George would not have had friendships due to moving around so much for work. It would have been very unusual for two men to travel around together due to work being scarce. George is a small, quick-witted man. His intelligence contrasts with Lenny's throughout the book, as does his size. George often has to think quickly in order to cover up for Lenny's mistakes. Finally, he feels forced to shoot his best friend, in order to protect him from Curly and the other men, who George believes would have tortured Lenny if they found him first. Lenny's opposite. How is George like this? George is described as small, quick, and intelligent. The man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. The language used here, such as quick, restless, and sharp, are a physical reflection of George's intelligence and quick thinking. This proves a strong contrast with Lenny, who is large and slow. He's frustrated with Lenny. How is George like this? George's reaction to Lenny when he makes mistakes can be short-tempered and angry. Evidence. If you forget that already, did you? I gotta tell you again, do I? Analysis. George's rhetorical questions, which he knows that Lenny cannot really answer, shows his frustration with his companion. He's grateful for his friendship with Lenny. George recognises that he and Lenny are different with other men because they have each other, which means they are not lonely. Evidence. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. Analysis. Plural pronouns, we and us, are repeated to show that George and Lenny are united and stay together, unlike many men like them. He builds up an impression of their loneliness through giving the 3 short, definite statements about their relationship. Caring. George is protective of Lenny and tries to look after him. When he kills Lenny, he is trying to protect him from Curly and the other men. Lenny says, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, says George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't now. That's a thing I want you to know. George is reassuring to Lenny. Even after he has done a terrible thing by killing Curly's wife, George is just about to kill Lenny here, and he is kind to him first, making sure that he knows that George cares about him and forgives him, so that Lenny can die in peace, knowing that George isn't angry with him. Lenny, in contrast, a description. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes, with wide sloping shoulders. Lenny is innocent. Lenny is kind and innocent, and so does not understand other characters' cruelty and anger properly. Evidence. Lenny covers his face with huge paws and bleated with terror. He cried, "Make him stop, George." Lenny is described using animalistic language, paws and bleated, showing his lack of understanding as Curly attacks him. Rather than defend himself, which he would do easily because of his size, he looks to George for help and protection. He's sweet-natured, evidence. That's good, he said. You drink some, George. You take a good big drink, he smiled happily. Even though George has just told Lenny off, Lenny quickly moves on and is focused on the immediate positive experience. The way he smiled happily because that he suggests that he is focused on simple pleasures and can be satisfied with small things in life. He is not demanding.